The next morning, Zira arrived at the workshop before Jake had even finished his breakfast. Her parents carried her inside and placed her floating chair near Jake's main workbench. The girl's eyes were bright with excitement and her skin glowed with happy yellow patterns. She had barely slept, her mother explained with an amused smile. Zira had been too excited thinking about the Podracer. Jake showed Zira his preliminary designs on a holographic display. The image floated in the air between them, showing a sleek racing vehicle from different angles. Zira leaned forward, studying every detail with intense focus. Then she started asking questions. How powerful would the engines be? What kind of fuel system would they use? How would the steering work without physical controls? Jake was impressed by how much she knew. Most 10-year-old children, human or alien, could not have understood the technical details he was describing. But Zira had studied podracers obsessively for years. She knew the specifications of famous racing machines better than some professional mechanics. When Jake explained something, she immediately grasped the concept and often suggested improvements. They spent the first week just planning and designing. Jake would sketch an idea, and Zira would point out potential problems or ways to make it better. She had a natural instinct for how machines worked, even though she had never actually built anything before. Her years of watching races and studying designs had given her a deep theoretical knowledge that Jake found invaluable. The foundation of their Podracer would be a salvaged frame that Jake had bought from a Kryn smuggler months ago. The Kryn were obsessed with speed and built their racers to go as fast as possible, with little thought for safety or comfort. Jake stripped the frame down to its basic skeleton, removing everything unnecessary. Then he began reinforcing it with stronger materials. Jake used human-designed metal alloys that were both lighter and stronger than what the Kryn used. He explained to Zira that human engineers had learned special ways to combine different metals to create materials with properties that neither metal had alone. Zira watched carefully as he welded and shaped the new frame, asking questions about every technique he used. The engines were the next challenge. Jake could not afford new racing engines, which cost more than most small spacecraft. Instead, he salvaged parts from 3 different broken ships. He took a thrust generator from an old cargo hauler, a fuel injection system from a fighter jet, and cooling units from a mining vessel. Then he combined them in a way that no manual had ever described. It took 2 weeks of trial and error to get the hybrid engine system working properly. There were explosions, small fires, and moments when Jake wanted to throw his tools across the room in frustration. But each failure taught them something new. Zira helped by running calculations on her data pad, checking Jake's math and suggesting different configurations to try. When the engines finally roared to life for the first time, the entire workshop shook with the sound. Jake had to shout over the noise to tell Zira that it was working. The girl's face lit up with pure joy and her skin blazed with excited orange patterns. Her parents, who had been watching nervously from the corner, hugged each other in relief. But the engines were the easy part compared to what came next. The neural interface was the real challenge, the piece of technology that would make or break the entire project. Standard pod racers used physical controls like steering sticks and pedals. A pilot needed to use their hands and feet to control the machine. That would not work for Zira. Jake needed to build a system that could read Zira's thoughts and translate them instantly into commands for the pod racer. The technology existed in experimental form, mostly used in hospitals to help injured patients control artificial limbs. But using it for something as fast and complex as racing was completely different. The margin for error was tiny. A moment of delay or a misread signal could mean a fatal crash. Jake contacted everyone he knew who understood neural technology. He sent messages to old military friends, doctors, and research scientists. They sent him information, technical specifications, and warnings about how difficult it would be. Many told him he was attempting something impossible. But they also sent him the tools and software he would need to try. For 3 weeks, Jake studied neural mapping and brain-computer interfaces. He learned how to read electrical signals from the brain and translate them into digital commands. He discovered that every person's brain was slightly different, which meant the system had to be customized specifically for Zira. There could be no generic solution. The sensor array that would read Zira's thoughts looked like a crown made of thin metal strips. Jake fabricated it carefully, making sure each sensor was positioned exactly right. Then came the hard part, teaching the system to understand what Zira's brain signals meant. They started with simple exercises. Jake would have Zira think about moving forward, and the computer would record her brain patterns. Then she would think about turning left, turning right, stopping, accelerating. For hours each day, Zira sat with the sensor crown on her head, thinking about racing movements while the computer learned her unique mental signature. It was exhausting work. Zira often ended the sessions with terrible headaches, her skin pale and drained of color. But she never complained or asked to stop. She pushed herself harder than Jake thought was healthy, determined to make the system work. Her parents worried, but they also understood that this dream was everything to their daughter. Slowly, gradually, the system began to respond. At first, the reactions were random and meaningless, but as the computer gathered more data and refined its understanding, the responses became more accurate. After a month of training, the system could correctly interpret Zira's thoughts about 70% of the time. Jake knew they needed better than that. In a real race, 70% accuracy would kill her. They needed 95% or higher, with response times measured in milliseconds. So they kept training, kept refining, kept pushing the system to be better. Zira proved to be a natural at mental visualization. She could imagine racing scenarios with incredible clarity, seeing every detail in her mind. Jake had her practice by thinking through entire race courses, visualizing every turn and obstacle. The system learned not just her basic commands, but her racing instincts, the subtle ways she thought about speed and trajectory and timing. After 2 more months of work, Jake installed the neural interface into the Podracer's control system. The machine was finally complete, a sleek racing vehicle unlike anything else in the galaxy. It combined salvage parts and human engineering with cutting-edge neural technology. On paper, it should not have worked. But Jake had learned long ago that human engineering was often about making things work that should not be possible. 3 months after they started the project, the Podracer was ready for its first real test. Jake had secured permission to use one of the station's abandoned cargo bays, a massive empty space that had once held shipping containers, but was now forgotten and unused. It was perfect for what they needed, large enough to set up a simple racing course, but enclosed enough to be safe if something went wrong. Jake spent the morning setting up holographic markers to create a basic course. Nothing too complicated, just a series of turns and straight sections that would test the Podracer's basic functions. He checked and rechecked every system on the machine, running diagnostic programs and manually inspecting connections. He had built this Podracer with his own hands, but he was still nervous. If something failed during the test, Zira could be seriously hurt or killed. Zira's parents arrived early, bringing their daughter in her floating chair. The father's skin showed worried purple patterns, while the mother kept her colors carefully neutral, trying not to show her fear. They had signed legal documents acknowledging the risks, but Jake knew that paperwork did nothing to ease a parent's anxiety about their child's safety. Zira herself showed no fear at all. Her skin glowed with excited gold and orange colors, and she could not stop smiling. She had been waiting for this moment for months, dreaming about it every night. Jake had never seen anyone so eager to climb into an untested machine that could easily malfunction and kill them. Getting Zira into the Podracer's cockpit was a careful process. Jake had designed the seat to support her entire body, with special padding and restraints that would hold her secure even during high-speed turns. The seat curved around her like a protective shell, and the restraints locked with solid clicks that echoed in the empty cargo bay. Then came the neural interface crown. Jake placed it on Zira's head gently, making sure each sensor made proper contact with her skin. The crown's lights blinked green one by one as each sensor activated and connected to the main system. When all the lights were green, Jake stepped back and checked his handheld monitor. Everything looked good. The connection was strong and stable. Jake walked to a safe distance and activated his remote monitoring system. His handheld screen showed him everything the Podracer was doing, from engine temperature to neural signal strength. He could shut down the entire system remotely if anything went wrong. He took a deep breath and gave Zira the signal to try a simple forward movement. The Podracer lurched violently forward, then stopped hard enough to throw Zira against her restraints. Jake's heart jumped into his throat. Zira's face flushed deep blue with embarrassment. Her first attempt had been a complete failure, and Jake could see her disappointment even from across the cargo bay. Jake called out encouragement, his voice echoing in the large space. He told her to relax, to stop trying so hard. The neural interface worked best when she did not force it, when she let her thoughts flow naturally instead of concentrating too hard. Zira nodded and closed her eyes, taking several deep breaths to calm herself. She tried again. This time the movement was smoother. The Podracer glided forward a few meters, responding to her mental command. It was still a bit jerky, but much better than the first attempt. Zira's skin began to shift to happier colors. She tried a gentle turn and the Podracer responded, curving to the left with only a slight wobble. Over the next hour, Jake watched as girl and machine began to synchronize. Each movement became smoother and more confident than the last. Zira's natural talent was becoming obvious. She had an instinct for how the Podracer would respond, learning to anticipate its movements and adjust her thoughts accordingly. Jake checked his monitor constantly, watching the neural signal patterns. The interface was performing even better than he had hoped. The response time between Zira's thought and the Podracer's action was measured in milliseconds, faster than most manual pilots could move their hands. The synchronization rate was climbing steadily, already past 80% and still improving. Zira began navigating the simple course Jake had set up. At first she went slowly, carefully thinking through each turn. But as her confidence grew, she started to increase her speed. The Podracer's engines hummed louder as she accelerated, and the sound filled the cargo bay with a powerful rumble. Jake's parents watched with growing amazement as their daughter raced through the course. The Podracer was responding to her thoughts as naturally as a healthy person's body responded to their brain. She was not fighting the machine or struggling to control it. She was simply thinking about where she wanted to go, and the Podracer was taking her there. By the end of the first session, Zira was executing turns and acceleration bursts that would have impressed experienced pilots. She was pushing the Podracer faster with each lap, testing its limits and her own abilities. Jake had to remind her several times to slow down and not take unnecessary risks, but he was grinning despite himself. This was working better than he had dared to hope. When Jake finally called an end to the session, Zira did not want to stop. She begged for just a few more minutes, just one more lap. Jake firmly said no. The first test had been a success, but he did not want to push their luck. They would come back tomorrow and the day after that, gradually increasing the difficulty and duration of the practice sessions. As Jake helped lift Zira out of the cockpit, he saw tears streaming down her face. For a moment he was alarmed, thinking something had hurt her, but then he realized they were tears of pure joy. Zira grabbed his hand and squeezed it tightly. She spoke in her own language, and her father translated the words with his own voice, breaking with emotion. She had said that Jake had given her wings. For the first time in her life, she had felt truly free. Her body had not mattered. Her disability had not held her back. She had flown. Jake felt something warm and unfamiliar in his chest, an emotion he had not experienced in years. It might have been pride or satisfaction, or maybe just the simple pleasure of knowing he had done something genuinely good. He had spent 3 years on this station, fixing broken machines for money. But this was different. This was about fixing a broken dream and giving a young girl a chance to be more than her damaged body. Zira's parents were both crying openly now, their skin blazing with grateful golden colors. They tried to thank Jake, but he waved them off, uncomfortable with the emotional display. He simply told them to bring Zira back tomorrow. They had more work to do. If Zira was going to race for real, she needed to be perfect. Good enough was not acceptable when lives were at stake. That night, Jake stayed late in his workshop reviewing all the data from the test. He made notes about small adjustments he wanted to make, ways to improve the response time even more. He studied the recording of Zira's practice session, analyzing her technique and looking for areas where she could improve. As he watched the footage of the Podracer flying through the cargo bay, Jake allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had built something remarkable. Not just a machine, but a tool for freedom. And tomorrow they would make it even better. Because that was what humans did best. They built impossible things, and then they found ways to make them better still. News traveled fast in the underground communities of Station Outpost 7. Within a week of Zira's successful test flight, people were talking about the paralyzed Velnar girl and her miracle Podracer. The station's racing community was a tight group of thrill-seekers, criminals, and misfits who gathered in dark corners to discuss their illegal passion. They had heard the rumors and wanted to see if they were true. One evening, a scarred alien named Vex arrived at Jake's workshop. Vex was a Thorian, a species known for their tough armor-like skin and aggressive nature. He had cybernetic eyes that glowed with red light, the result of a racing accident years ago that had nearly killed him. Vex organized races in the underground circuit, arranging venues and managing the betting that made the events profitable. Vex looked at Zira's Podracer with obvious skepticism. He had heard the stories, but he did not believe them. A paralyzed child controlling a racer with her thoughts? It sounded like fantasy or a scam. But he was curious enough to make an offer. There was a race scheduled in 2 weeks at an abandoned mining station 3 systems away. If Zira wanted to prove herself, she could enter. Jake discussed the offer with Zira's parents that night. The father was terrified of the risk. Underground races were incredibly dangerous. Pilots died regularly, crashing into walls or other racers at speeds that turned vehicles into fireballs. Even experienced veterans with years of training could not guarantee they would survive a race. How could they risk their daughter's life like this? But Zira herself was determined. This was what she had been working toward for months. She did not want to just fly around an empty cargo bay. She wanted to race for real, to test herself against other pilots, to prove that she belonged in the cockpit. Her mother understood, even though it scared her. Sometimes parents had to let their children take risks if those risks were important enough. After hours of difficult conversation, they agreed. Zira would race, but only if Jake came with her as her crew chief. Jake would be responsible for the Podracer's maintenance and for making the final decision about whether conditions were safe enough to race. If Jake said it was too dangerous, Zira would not fly. The father made Jake promise this, and Jake agreed. The next 2 weeks were intense. Jake worked on the Podracer constantly, fine-tuning every system to perform at maximum efficiency. He upgraded the engines with better cooling systems so they could run at high power for longer periods. He reinforced the hull with additional armor in critical areas. He adjusted the neural interface sensitivity, making it even more responsive to Zira's thoughts. Zira trained every day in the cargo bay. Jake set up more complex courses, adding obstacles and tighter turns. He recorded footage of real races and had Zira study them, learning how professional racers handled difficult situations. They practiced emergency procedures, training Zira on what to do if systems failed or if she got into trouble. Jake also taught Zira about racing strategy. It was not enough to be fast. She needed to understand positioning, when to push hard and when to hold back and conserve power. She needed to learn how to read other pilots, anticipating their moves and finding opportunities to overtake them. Racing was as much about thinking as it was about speed. The day before the race, they loaded the Podracer onto a small transport ship and began the journey to the racing venue. The trip took 8 hours through empty space, giving everyone too much time to think about what was coming. Zira's parents sat quietly, their skin colors muted with worry. Zira herself seemed calm, almost meditative, mentally preparing herself for the challenge ahead. The abandoned mining station was a massive, hollowed-out asteroid. In its glory days, it had been home to thousands of workers extracting valuable minerals from the rock. Now it was empty and dark, its tunnels perfect for illegal racing. The course wound through the station's interior, a maze of narrow passages, sharp turns, and sections where artificial gravity failed completely. When they arrived at the station, Jake was struck by the rough atmosphere. This was not like the clean, organized races he had seen in official competitions. The pit area was just a large cavern filled with racers and their crews, everyone scrambling to prepare their machines. The air smelled of fuel and hot metal. Music with heavy bass pounded from makeshift speakers. Groups of spectators wandered between the racers, placing bets and drinking strange-colored liquids. The other pilots were a diverse mix of species, but they all had one thing in common. They looked dangerous. These were people who risked their lives for the thrill of speed and the small prizes that winners received. Many of them were covered in scars from previous crashes. Some had cybernetic replacements for lost limbs. They were survivors of a brutal sport that did not forgive mistakes. When the other racers saw Zira, their reactions ranged from confusion to mockery. A paralyzed child entering an underground race? It was absurd. Some laughed openly, making jokes about how quickly she would crash and die. Others shook their heads, thinking it was cruel for Jake to let her compete. A few looked angry, insulted that their dangerous sport was being treated like a game. Jake ignored the comments and focused on preparing the Podracer. He checked every system twice, making sure nothing had been damaged during transport. He ran diagnostic programs and manually tested connections. Everything had to be perfect. One small malfunction at racing speeds could be fatal. Vex, the race organizer, came by to verify that Zira's Podracer met the basic safety requirements. He was surprised to find that it did. Jake had made sure to include all the necessary safety features like emergency shutdown systems and reinforced cockpit protection. Vex grunted approval and moved on to the next racer. As the start time approached, Jake helped Zira into the cockpit. He secured her restraints and placed the neural interface crown on her head. The familiar green lights blinked on one by one. Jake leaned close and spoke quietly so only she could hear. He reminded her that she had nothing to prove to anyone but herself. She had already accomplished something amazing just by being here. Whatever happened in the race, she should be proud. But Jake could see in Zira's eyes that his words were not necessary. She was not nervous or afraid. She was focused and ready. This was what she had been born to do. The paralyzed legs did not matter anymore. In the cockpit, with the neural crown connecting her mind to the machine, she was not disabled. She was a pilot. The racers lined up at the starting position, their engines creating a deafening roar in the enclosed space. Jake retreated to the monitoring area where he could watch the race on screens and track Zira's vital signs. His heart was pounding harder than he wanted to admit. He had built the Podracer as safely as he could, but racing was always dangerous. He would not forgive himself if something happened to her. The countdown began. Jake gripped his monitoring device so hard his knuckles turned white. Around him, the crowd was screaming and cheering, excited for the violence and spectacle they were about to witness. In a few seconds, 20 Podracers would launch into those narrow tunnels at insane speeds. Not all of them would finish the race. Some might not survive it. The starting signal flashed green and 20 Podracers exploded forward in a thunderous roar. The sound was overwhelming, echoing off the rock walls of the tunnel and creating a physical pressure that Jake could feel in his chest. On his monitoring screen, he could see the mass of racers jostling for position as they screamed into the first narrow passage. Zira had started near the back of the pack, as rookie racers always did. Jake watched her position on the tracking display, his heart racing as fast as the engines. The first minute of any race was the most dangerous, when aggressive pilots fought for the best positions and crashes were common. Already he could see 2 racers had collided and dropped out, their machines too damaged to continue. But Zira was not getting caught up in the chaos at the front. She was hanging back slightly, observing the other racers and learning their patterns. Jake realized she was being smart, not reckless. She was treating this first lap as a learning experience, mapping the course and understanding how the other pilots raced. As the racers came around to complete the first lap, Jake could see Zira had moved up to 14th place. She had not forced her way forward aggressively. Instead, she had been patient, finding small gaps and slipping through them. On his monitor, Jake could see her neural interface was working perfectly. The synchronization rate was at 97%, which meant her thoughts were translating almost instantly into the Podracer's actions. The second lap was where Zira began to show what she could really do. She had learned the course now, memorized every turn and obstacle. Jake watched in amazement as she started taking racing lines that the other pilots were not using. She would enter a turn from an unexpected angle, or she would accelerate through a section where others were braking. The neural interface gave her an advantage that the veteran pilots could not match. Her reaction time was measured in the speed of thought. When she saw an opportunity, she could respond instantly, without the delay of moving her hands to controls. She could make tiny adjustments constantly, optimizing her path through every meter of the course. By the middle of lap 2, Zira had climbed to 10th place. The crowd in the viewing areas was beginning to notice her. The betting boards were updating rapidly as people realized this strange paralyzed girl was actually competitive. Jake could hear the confusion and excitement in the voices around him. Nobody had expected this. Zira passed 2 more racers when they made mistakes in a difficult section, where the tunnel split 3 ways. Most pilots took the wider left or right paths because they were easier to navigate. Zira chose the center path, which was narrower but more direct. Her thought-speed reactions allowed her to navigate the tight space perfectly, and she emerged ahead of racers who had taken the easier routes. By lap 3, Zira was in 5th place. Jake could barely breathe as he watched her climb through the field. The racers ahead of her were experienced veterans who had been racing for years, but Zira was matching them turn for turn, and in some sections she was clearly faster. Her study of racing footage and her natural talent were combining with the neural interface to create something special. The fourth lap brought her into third place when two racers ahead tangled with each other trying to block her advance. Both of them crashed into the tunnel wall, their pod racers exploding in showers of sparks and metal. Zira shot through the gap they left behind, her focus never wavering despite the violence happening around her. Jake checked her vital signs anxiously. Her heart rate was elevated but not dangerous. Her stress hormones were high but manageable. She was in the zone, that mental state where athletes performed at their absolute peak. Everything else in the universe had disappeared for her. There was only the race, the machine, and the tunnel ahead. Now there were only two racers ahead of Zira. The one in second place was a veteran Kryn pilot named Raxor, known for his aggressive style and multiple championship wins. The one in first was a human woman named Lisa Harper, considered one of the best pilots in the underground circuit. Both of them had noticed Zira now and were pushing their machines harder, refusing to let a rookie overtake them. The fifth lap was when Zira made her move on Raxor. There was a section where the artificial gravity failed, and racers had to navigate in 3 dimensions. Most pilots hated this part because it was disorienting, but Zira had practiced zero-gravity maneuvering extensively in simulations. She dove under Raxor's pod racer in a move that made Jake's stomach drop, threading through a space that seemed impossibly small. Raxor tried to block her, but he could not match her thought-speed reactions. Zira was through before he could respond, pulling into second place. The crowd was going absolutely wild now, their cheers and screams echoing through the station. This was the kind of drama they came to see, an unknown rookie challenging the best pilots. Now only Lisa Harper remained ahead. The final lap began with Zira closing the gap steadily. Jake could see on his monitors that both pod racers were pushing their engines to maximum output. Temperature warnings were flashing on his screen, but both machines were still within safe limits. Barely. Lisa was an expert at defensive racing, positioning her pod racer to block Zira's attempts to pass. Every time Zira tried to find an opening, Lisa would shift to close it off. They raced through the tunnels side by side, sometimes so close that Jake was certain they would collide. Zira tried to pass on the inside of a tight turn, but Lisa anticipated the move and blocked it. She tried going wide on the outside, but Lisa matched her. The two pod racers were locked in a battle of skill and nerve, neither willing to give an inch. Then Zira did something that made Jake's jaw drop. In the final tunnel before the finish line, there was a slight gravitational anomaly that most racers avoided because it could throw off their trajectory. Zira aimed directly for it. She used the gravitational pull to slingshot her pod racer forward, gaining a burst of speed that the other racers never used. Lisa tried to react, tried to match the move, but she was a split second too slow. Zira's pod racer pulled ahead, the gap between them growing to half a meter, then a full meter. They crossed the finish line with Zira in front by less than a second. For a moment everything was silent as the results were calculated and verified. Then the announcement came through the speakers. Zira had won. First place. A paralyzed Velnar girl in her first real race had beaten some of the best pilots in the underground circuit. The crowd exploded with noise. Some were cheering, amazed at what they had witnessed. Others were screaming in anger, having lost huge bets on the veteran pilots. Fights were breaking out in the viewing areas between winners and losers. Jake did not care about any of that. He was running toward the finish area where the pod racers were coming to rest. When Zira's machine finally stopped and he could help remove her from the cockpit, he saw tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but pure, overwhelming joy. Zira's parents rushed over, their skin blazing with every happy color at once. They were crying and laughing and trying to hug their daughter all at the same time. Other racers were approaching too, including Raxor and Lisa. Jake tensed, ready to defend Zira if they were angry about being beaten, but Raxor just extended his clawed hand in the Kryn gesture of respect. He told Zira in his rough voice that she had raced well, that she had earned her victory fairly. Lisa nodded in agreement, saying that losing to a better pilot was no shame. They both welcomed Zira to the racing community. That night, back at Station Outpost 7, Jake sat alone in his workshop. The Podracer sat in the center of the room, its hull scorched and scratched from the race but intact. He had built this machine with salvaged parts and human ingenuity. He had given a paralyzed girl the chance to fly. And she had proven that disability was not destiny, that limitations could be overcome with the right tools and enough determination. Jake smiled to himself in the quiet workshop. This was why humans did what they did. They built impossible things. They solved problems that others said could not be solved. They gave wings to those who had been told they could never fly. And sometimes those people soared higher than anyone ever imagined. Within hours of Zira's victory, video footage of the race was spreading across the local networks. Someone in the crowd had recorded the final lap and uploaded it to public data streams. By the next morning, the footage had jumped to regional channels. By afternoon, it was being discussed on news programs across multiple systems in the Galactic Union. The story was impossible to resist. A paralyzed 10-year-old girl had beaten experienced veterans in her first real race. The footage showed her Podracer moving with impossible precision, threading through gaps that seemed too small, making turns that looked like they violated physics. People who knew nothing about racing were sharing the video and talking about it. Jake's workshop was flooded with messages. Racing sponsors wanted to offer Zira contracts for official circuits. Media outlets requested interviews. Technology companies wanted to study the neural interface system he had built. Even some legitimate racing teams expressed interest, though Jake suspected they cared more about publicity than about Zira herself. The Velnar family was completely overwhelmed. They were simple merchants who had never dealt with this kind of attention. Their message systems were overloaded with contacts. Strangers approached them on the station wanting to meet Zira or take pictures with her. Some offered money, others wanted favors, and a few made vague threats about what would happen if they did not cooperate. Jake tried to protect them as much as he could. He set up filters on their communication systems to block the worst spam. He dealt with the legitimate offers himself, reviewing contracts and turning down anything that seemed exploitative. He became Zira's unofficial manager, a role he had never expected to play. But not everyone was celebrating Zira's success. The underground racing community was deeply divided. Some racers hailed her as a pioneer, proof that talent mattered more than physical ability. They respected what she had accomplished and welcomed her as one of their own. Others were suspicious and hostile. They claimed the neural interface gave her an unfair advantage, that she was essentially cheating by using technology that manual pilots could not access. They argued that racing should be about physical skill, about the connection between a pilot's hands and their machine. Zira's thought-controlled Podracer violated the spirit of the sport, they said. The complaints grew louder when Zira entered and won 2 more races over the following month. She was not just lucky or having a good day. She was consistently dominant, finishing first or second in every race she entered. Her technique was flawless and her machine was reliable. Other pilots were struggling to keep up with her. Some racers filed formal complaints with race organizers, demanding that Zira's Podracer be inspected for illegal modifications. Each time Jake allowed the inspections, each time the officials found nothing against the rules. The neural interface was unusual, but there were no specific regulations prohibiting it. Jake had been careful to stay within the technical guidelines, even if he was pushing the boundaries of what those guidelines meant. The situation reached a crisis point when Zira qualified for the Outer Rim Championship, one of the most prestigious races in the underground circuit. The prize money was substantial, enough to change a modest family's entire financial situation. The competition would be fierce, with top pilots from across the lawless territories competing. Jake knew that winning this race would cement Zira's reputation as a serious racer. But he also knew it would bring intense scrutiny. The Outer Rim Championship had connections to powerful people, including some who had influence with the Galactic Union's regulatory bodies. If Zira won, she would not be able to stay under the radar anymore. 3 days before the championship race, everything changed. A sleek diplomatic vessel appeared at Station Outpost 7, its hull bearing the official markings of the Galactic Union's Racing Commission. The station administrator sent Jake an urgent message. A Union diplomat had arrived and was asking to meet with him and the Velnar family immediately. Jake felt his stomach twist with anxiety. The Galactic Union's Racing Commission was the regulatory body that oversaw all official racing across civilized space. They had no formal jurisdiction over the underground circuits which operated in lawless zones outside Union control, but they had enormous influence and resources. If they decided Zero was a problem, they could make her life very difficult. The meeting was scheduled in one of the station's administrative chambers. The room was cold and sterile, designed more for interrogations than friendly conversations. Jake arrived with Zira's parents, who were terrified despite his attempts to reassure them. Zira herself was there in her floating chair, her skin showing muted colors that revealed her nervousness. Ambassador Torvin Klesch entered the room like he owned it. He was a tall Xylar, a species known for their rigid adherence to rules and regulations. His skin was black as polished obsidian, and his eyes were completely white with no visible pupils. He wore formal diplomatic robes that marked his high status in the Union bureaucracy. 2 legal advisors and several technical experts accompanied him, all carrying data pads and wearing serious expressions. Klesch did not waste time on pleasantries. He stated his purpose immediately. The Racing Commission had received numerous complaints about Zira's Podracer and her racing activities. These complaints alleged that her neural interface technology constituted an unfair competitive advantage, potentially violating several treaties regarding cybernetic enhancement in sporting competitions. Jake started to argue, but Klesch raised his hand for silence. The diplomat continued speaking in his formal, precise manner. The commission was not making accusations at this point. They were conducting an investigation. But until that investigation was complete, certain measures needed to be taken to preserve the integrity of competitive racing. Klesch pulled out an official document and began reading from it. Effective immediately, Zira's Podracer would be impounded for technical analysis. Zira herself would be suspended from all racing activities, both official and unofficial. Any attempt to circumvent these restrictions would result in sanctions against Station Outpost 7 and criminal charges against Jake for facilitating illegal enhancement technology. The words hit Jake like physical blows. Zira's parents gasped, their skin flashing with distressed colors. Zira herself just stared at Klesch, her young face showing a mixture of shock and grief that was painful to see. Jake found his voice and demanded to know the legal basis for this action. Klesch responded with more bureaucratic language, citing regulations and subsections and precedents that Jake could barely follow. The diplomat had clearly prepared his case carefully, building a legal framework that would be difficult to challenge. But Jake was not going to accept this without a fight. He argued that the neural interface was simply adaptive technology, no different from prosthetic limbs or medical devices that countless beings used across the galaxy. It was not enhancing Zira beyond normal capabilities, it was just compensating for her disability. Klesch dismissed this argument. The interface, he said, provided reaction speeds and precision that exceeded what manual pilots could achieve. The fact that it was designed for a disabled individual did not change the fundamental competitive advantage it created. The Union had to maintain standards of fairness, and those standards could not be compromised for emotional reasons. Jake felt rage building inside him, the kind of anger that made it hard to think clearly. This was not about fairness. This was about a bureaucrat asserting his authority, about powerful institutions crushing anyone who did not fit their comfortable categories. He had seen this before in his military service, and he had sworn he would never submit to it again. But what could he do? Klesch had the full power of the Galactic Union behind him. Fighting through official channels would take years and cost more money than Jake had, and in the meantime, Zira would be grounded, her dream stolen away by legal technicalities and bureaucratic procedures. Klesch's team began processing the paperwork for the impoundment. They would take the Podracer within the hour, transporting it to a Union facility for analysis. Zira would not even get to say goodbye to the machine that had given her freedom. Jake watched helplessly as they prepared to take away everything they had built together. Jake spent that night alone in his workshop, staring at the empty space where the Podracer had been. Klesch's team had taken it away, loading it onto their diplomatic vessel like it was evidence of a crime. Zira's parents had taken their daughter home, all of them crying. The girl's skin had been completely gray with grief, a color Jake had never seen on a Velnar before. He could not let this stand. He would not let some arrogant diplomat destroy what Zira had accomplished. But how could he fight back? The Galactic Union's bureaucracy was designed to crush individual resistance. Their lawyers and regulations could tie up any challenge for years. By the time the legal process finished, Zira would be too old to race, her moment lost forever. Jake needed a different approach. Something clever. Something that would use the Union's own rules against them. He pulled up his computer and began reading through every regulation and treaty that Klesch had cited during the meeting. The documents were hundreds of pages long, written in dense legal language that was deliberately difficult to understand. But Jake was patient and methodical. He read every word, made notes, and cross-referenced different sections. The Galactic Union's regulatory framework was massive and contradictory, the result of centuries of compromises between hundreds of different species and cultures. Where there were contradictions, there might be loopholes. Around 3 a.m, Jake found something interesting. The regulations defined enhancement technology as any system that improved a being's capabilities beyond their species' natural baseline. But there was an exception for what the regulations called restorative adaptive technology. These were systems designed to restore lost function to disabled individuals, bringing them up to but not beyond their species' normal capabilities. The distinction was subtle, but potentially crucial. Enhancement made you better than normal. Restoration made you normal when you had been less than that. The question was whether Zira's neural interface counted as enhancement or restoration. Jake spent the rest of the night gathering data. He contacted research centers that studied Velnar biology, requesting information about typical reaction times, reflexes, and motor control capabilities for healthy Velnar individuals. He explained his situation to several sympathetic scientists, and they sent him detailed studies and benchmark measurements. The next day, Jake compared this baseline data to Zira's actual performance in her races. He analyzed every recorded moment of her Podracer control, measuring her reaction speeds, decision-making time, and precision of movement. The work was tedious and required careful statistical analysis, but Jake was determined. The results were revealing. Zira's reaction times, while impressive, were completely within the normal range for a healthy Velnar. Her spatial reasoning and tactical thinking were excellent, but again not beyond what a healthy member of her species could achieve. What made her special was not superhuman capabilities, but exceptional skill and practice. The neural interface was not making her faster or smarter than a healthy Velnar pilot using manual controls. It was simply allowing her to express the abilities she already had despite her paralyzed body. That was the key difference between enhancement and restoration. Jake reached out to his network of contacts across human space. He sent messages to neurologists who specialized in brain-computer interfaces. He contacted bioethicists who studied the philosophy of disability and enhancement. He asked engineers who designed prosthetics for injured veterans. Many of them were familiar with technology similar to what he had built for Zira. The responses came back over the following days. Doctor after doctor, expert after expert provided statements supporting Jake's argument. They explained that Zira's neural interface was fundamentally restorative in nature. It was not giving her capabilities beyond what a healthy Velnar could achieve. It was simply providing an alternative pathway for her brain to control a racing vehicle when the normal pathway through her spine and legs was broken. One neurologist explained it with a simple analogy. If a person lost their hand and received a prosthetic hand that worked as well as their original hand, nobody would call that enhancement. It was restoration. Zira's neural interface was the same principle, just applied to a different kind of movement. Jake also reached out to members of the racing community. He asked pilots who had raced against Zira to provide testimony about their experiences. To his surprise, many were willing to help. Even some who had initially complained about her technology now said they had changed their minds after racing against her. Raxer, the veteran Kryn pilot who Zira had beaten in her first race, was particularly supportive. He sent Jake a recorded statement saying that he had been beaten by superior skill, not by unfair technology. Zira's victories came from talent and practice, not from artificial enhancement. Several other racers echoed this sentiment. Lisa Harper, the human pilot who had finished second in Zira's debut race, also provided a statement. She explained that after racing against Zira multiple times, She understood that the neural interface was simply a different control method, not a performance advantage. A skilled pilot with manual controls could match Zira's performance. The difference was that Zira could not use manual controls because of her disability. Jake compiled all of this evidence into a massive legal document. It included technical specifications of the neural interface, medical data about Zira's condition, expert testimonies from scientists and doctors, statements from other racers, and careful analysis of the union's own regulations. The document was over 200 pages long when he finished. The core argument was simple. The Galactic Union's regulations explicitly allowed restorative adaptive technology. Zira's neural interface met the definition of such technology. It restored her ability to pilot a Podracer to the level a healthy Velnar could achieve, nothing more. Banning her from racing was not about maintaining fairness. It was discrimination against a disabled individual using legally protected adaptive technology. Jake knew this was a long shot. The Union did not like being challenged, especially by humans operating on the fringes of civilized space. Bureaucrats like Klesch built their careers on enforcing regulations, not on making exceptions. But Jake had to try. He had to give Zira a fighting chance. He formally requested a hearing to contest the impoundment and racing ban. He submitted his legal document through official channels, following every proper procedure to ensure it could not be dismissed on technicalities. Then he waited for a response. To his surprise, Klesch agreed to the hearing within 2 days. Jake suspected the diplomat was confident in his position and wanted to publicly demonstrate his authority. Klesch probably expected to crush Jake's legal challenge easily, making an example of anyone who dared question Union regulations. The hearing was scheduled for 5 days later. Jake spent that time preparing, reviewing his arguments and anticipating counter-arguments. He practiced speaking in formal legal language, trying to sound professional rather than emotional. He knew that showing anger or passion would just make him seem irrational to the bureaucrats. Zira's parents asked if they should hire a real lawyer, someone trained in union law. But Jake explained that lawyers were expensive and would take months to get up to speed on the technical details. He had built the Podracer and understood the technology better than any lawyer could. He would have to represent them himself. The night before the hearing, Jake visited Zira's family at their quarters on the station. The girl was deeply depressed, her skin still showing that awful gray color. She barely spoke anymore, spending her days staring at recordings of races she would never participate in again. Jake knelt beside her chair and spoke quietly. He told her that tomorrow he was going to fight for her right to race. He could not promise victory, but he could promise that he would give everything he had. She had worked too hard and accomplished too much for him to just give up without a fight. Zira looked at him with her large eyes and whispered that she trusted him. That simple statement hit Jake harder than any dramatic speech could have. This young girl believed in him, depended on him. He could not let her down. That night, Jake barely slept. He reviewed his arguments one final time, checking every citation and verifying every piece of evidence. This hearing was Zira's only realistic chance to get her dream back. If he failed tomorrow, the bureaucracy would grind on for years, and by the time any appeal was resolved, Zira's opportunity would be gone forever. Everything depended on what happened in that hearing room. The hearing took place in the station's largest conference facility, which had been hastily converted into a makeshift courtroom. The room was filled with people who had heard about the case and wanted to watch. Racers from the underground circuit occupied the back rows. Station residents crowded in doorways. Several journalists had set up recording equipment, hoping to capture dramatic footage. Ambassador Klesch sat at a raised platform at the front of the room, flanked by his legal advisors and technical experts from the Racing Commission. They looked professional and confident, their data pads glowing with prepared arguments. Jake sat at a simple table facing them, with Zira beside him in her floating chair, and her parents standing nervously behind her. Klesch opened the hearing with formal statements about the Racing Commission's authority and the importance of maintaining fair competition standards across the galaxy. His voice was calm and measured, the voice of someone who had presided over hundreds of similar proceedings. He was completely in his element, and he knew it. Then Klesch presented his case against Zira's neural interface. He displayed charts showing her reaction times compared to manual pilots. He cited studies about human-machine interfaces and their potential for enhancement. He referenced multiple treaties and regulations about cybernetic competition advantages. His argument was detailed and seemingly airtight. The neural interface gave Zira capabilities that manual pilots could not match. Therefore, it was an unfair advantage that violated the spirit of competitive racing. Jake listened patiently, taking notes, but not interrupting. When Klesh finished and asked if Jake had any response, Jake stood and addressed the room. He deliberately avoided looking at Klesh, instead speaking directly to the crowd of observers. He knew this hearing was about public opinion as much as legal technicalities. Jake began by telling Zira's story. He described a young girl born with a condition that paralyzed her legs who dreamed of racing, but was told she never could. He explained how they had worked together for months to build a machine that could give her a chance. He spoke plainly without legal jargon, making the case that this was fundamentally about fairness and opportunity. Then Jake shifted to his technical arguments. He displayed the data he had gathered showing that Zira's performance metrics were within normal ranges for a healthy Velnar. He explained that the neural interface was not making her superhuman. It was simply providing an alternative control method. He compared it to prosthetic limbs that allowed amputees to walk or use their hands normally. Jake called up his first expert witness, a human neurologist named Dr. Patricia Wells, who appeared via holographic projection. She explained the difference between enhancement technology and restorative technology in clear, simple terms. Enhancement made you better than baseline. Restoration brought you up to baseline when disability had placed you below it. Zira's interface was clearly restorative. Klesh tried to interrupt, arguing that this was just semantics. But Jake had anticipated this objection. He pulled up the exact text of the Galactic Union regulations regarding adaptive technology. The law explicitly created an exception for restorative systems. This was not Jake's interpretation. It was the Union's own legal language. More expert witnesses followed. A bioethicist explained why denying disabled individuals access to restorative technology was considered discriminatory by civilized societies across the galaxy. An engineer who designed prosthetics for injured soldiers testified that Zira's neural interface was functionally identical to systems that the Union already approved for use by disabled athletes in other sports. Then, Jake called Raxer to testify. The tough Kryn racer appeared via hologram, his scarred face filling the display. He spoke in his characteristically blunt manner, stating that he had raced against Zira multiple times. Each time he had been beaten fairly. The neural interface did not make her superhuman. It just allowed her to race on equal terms with able-bodied pilots. Several other racers provided similar testimony, creating a chorus of voices supporting Zira. These were not activists or theorists. These were the actual pilots who competed against her, who had the most to lose if she truly had an unfair advantage. And they were saying she did not. Lisa Harper, the human pilot, made perhaps the most compelling statement. She said that after racing against Zira, she understood something important. The neural interface was just a different way of translating thoughts into machine control. Every pilot did this, whether through manual controls or neural signals. The interface did not make Zira's thoughts faster or better. It just provided a different pathway for those thoughts to reach the Podracer. Jake could see that the crowd was responding to these testimonies. People were nodding, whispering to each other, clearly moved by what they were hearing. Even some of Klesh's advisors looked uncertain, conferring quietly and reviewing their datapads with furrowed expressions. But Klesh remained unmoved. He argued that the testimonies were subjective opinions, not objective facts. The Racing Commission's technical analysis showed clear performance advantages in the neural interface's response times. The law could not be interpreted based on emotional appeals. This was the moment Jake had been preparing for. He displayed a comprehensive statistical analysis comparing Zira's performance to baseline Velnar capabilities. Every metric, every measurement showed that she was within normal ranges. He then showed similar data for several famous racing pilots from various species, demonstrating that their performance also exceeded some averages, but was still considered fair. Jake argued that Klesh was using a double standard. When able-bodied pilots showed exceptional performance, it was called talent. When a disabled pilot using adaptive technology showed the same level of performance, it was called an unfair advantage. This was discrimination, pure and simple. He ended with a direct challenge to Klesh. Jake quoted the union's own regulations about restorative technology, reading the exact legal language that protected such systems. He pointed out that the Racing Commission had approved similar neural interfaces for disabled athletes in other sports. Why was Zira being treated differently? What made her case special except for the fact that she was winning? Jake's voice grew more passionate as he finished his argument. He said that the union could impound the Podracer and ban Zira from racing if they wanted, but they would be doing it based on prejudice, not on their own regulations. They would be punishing a disabled girl for having the courage to chase her dreams, and that would say more about the Galactic Union than it would about Zira. The room fell completely silent. Jake sat down, his heart pounding. He had said everything he could say, made every argument he could make. Now it was up to Klesh to decide. The ambassador sat motionless for a long moment, his white eyes unreadable. Then he leaned over and began conferring quietly with his legal advisors. The conversation went on for several minutes while everyone in the room waited with held breath. Jake could see the advisors pointing to their datapads, clearly debating something important. Finally, Klesh straightened and addressed the room. His voice was still formal, but Jake thought he detected a slight change in tone. The ambassador acknowledged that Jake had presented compelling evidence and arguments. The distinction between enhancement and restoration did have legal merit according to union regulations. Klesh continued, saying that the Racing Commission would need to establish new guidelines for neural interface technology in racing, but after reviewing the evidence presented, he could not justify continuing the current impoundment and ban. The neural interface did appear to fall within the legal definition of restorative adaptive technology. The ambassador formally announced that the impoundment order was rescinded. Zira's Podracer would be returned to her within 24 hours. The racing ban was lifted, though the commission would require regular technical inspections to ensure compliance with safety standards. Zira was free to race again. The room erupted in cheers. Zira's parents embraced their daughter, their skin blazing with joyful gold colors. Other racers were clapping and shouting approval. Even some of the journalists were smiling, clearly pleased with the outcome. Jake felt the tension drain from his body all at once, leaving him almost dizzy with relief. He had won. Against all odds, against the full power of the Galactic Union bureaucracy, he had actually won. Zira could race again. Zira herself was crying, but this time with happiness instead of grief. Her skin had returned to healthy colors, showing excited patterns that shifted and danced. She reached out and grabbed Jake's hand, squeezing it tightly. She did not need to say anything. Her gratitude was written in every color on her skin. Klesh left quickly, clearly unhappy with how the hearing had concluded. His advisors gathered their materials and followed him out. Jake suspected the ambassador would be looking for ways to create new regulations that would prevent similar situations in the future. But for now, Zira had won her freedom. Over the following days, the story of the hearing spread even faster than the original racing footage had. The image of a human mechanic defending a disabled alien girl against union bureaucracy resonated with people across many worlds. Jake received messages from disabled individuals thanking him for fighting for adaptive technology rights.